Afternoon, everybody. It is afternoon, right? Pretty sure. It's Tuesday. What day is it? Tuesday? Wednesday. Wednesday. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. I am going to assume that everyone can see my slides up here at this point. I was like, I can't see them, even though I've sat in this room and I know where the slides are. So let's get started, because I know there's a lot of other way more interesting stuff happening today. To get started, show of hands, who here likes JavaScript? Who here hates JavaScript? JavaScript is something that most developers have at the very least heard of, even if it's from another developer swearing at their computer trying to get it to work. So today, we're going to talk about why you don't need JavaScript and how you can build things without using any JavaScript. So to start off, I would like to introduce myself. Hi, my name is Amy. I have traveled a very, very long way, all the way from Australia. And I'm really excited because this is my first time in Copenhagen. I've been to a few different countries in Europe, but I've not made it to Denmark yet. And so I'm really excited to be in Copenhagen with you all this week. And that is only slightly influenced by the fact that on Saturday a bunch of us are going to Legoland and Lego House. I mean, the conference is fun, but Lego. I also have a beautiful dog who gets very disappointed when I go away to conferences, and so he generally makes it into my talk. Now, I want to start off. Okay, we're going to diss on JavaScript a little bit here today, in case you didn't work it out. But I want to start off by prefacing this, saying JavaScript is useful. JavaScript is a useful programming language, and it is a useful tool. But it's often overused. The thing is, HTML and CSS, in a lot of cases, are much lighter tools to use. So we're going to go through today, and we're going to build a bunch of things using HTML and CSS only. I'm talking no JavaScript. That means no build tools using JavaScript, no NPM packages, just HTML and CSS. So starting off, I want to look at a couple of HTML tricks. I'm going to start looking at some using targeting content, looking at accordions, and form validations. These are some of our very common things we use JavaScript for. First off, I'm going to look at content targeting. Can anyone here tell me what the link tag is in HTML? Not in React, not in Next.js, not in one of the other things. The HTML link tag. Which one's that? A? Yes. The link tag, or anchor tag, is used when we link to another page or website, a file or resource, so that could be an image or a PDF or something like that, or we can also use it to reference the ID of an element on our page or another page and send the user straight there. This is really useful because if you want to send them to the contact form, instead of sending them to one page, you can send them all the way to where the content form is. So this will then change the URL, and we end up with that hash value that appears in the URL. But using CSS, we can actually check whether or not an element is targeted as part of the URL. We can check whether that has already, whether that already exists as part of the hash value, and use CSS to change it. So I'm going to switch to do a bit of a demo now. This is a very beautiful website that I have built for today. And we can see here, we have just a couple of things here. I've got an index.html file, there's some styles, I've got some graphics and images and fonts that I'm going to load in. And so I have my HTML file here. This is what I'm going to go through and do a lot of work in. But I'm going to open up one of my HTML files here to get started. Now, because I don't trust doing live coding demos, I have some CSS here. What we can do is we can go through and reference the section element, and I'm then going to go through and hide all of the section elements. This is where the content exists on the page, but I'm then going to check if this section element is targeted, so if this the ID of this section element exists as a hash value in our URL, I would like to display it. What that does is this means I can create a single page application of sorts with no JavaScript whatsoever. My header stays, my footer stays, but the content that exists, it displays and hides depending on my hash value, which we can't quite see here because the URL bar isn't showing very well. But if I have a look here, I have here index.html hash toggle, which is the page I'm on. I can then go to facts, testimonials, home. So I'm able to go through and navigate to different pages of my single page application using only HTML. Now, browser support's one of the things that we should probably be thinking about in this case. And on the bright side, Target as a selector has been around for quite a while. So it's supported in pretty much all of the browsers, well, all of the well-used important browsers that we like to work with. So this one is actually pretty good to be able to use in production. I do kind of want to preface this, though, full disclosure. This involves working with the hash value in our URL and isn't a great alternative most of the time, and it's not spectacular for accessibility. So it's probably a good point to full disclosure. A lot of what I'm going to go through today is something that you can do, not necessarily something that you should do. So we're going to go through and have a bit of fun, but please don't go back and just word for word implement all of the things I show in your production applications, because there are several reasons why we don't do this. Next, I want to look at accordions. So accordions, something we often see in an FAQ section. We've got a bunch of questions, and you can click on it, and it expands out the answer. How do you normally do an accordion or a collapsible section? Anyone have anything they would normally reach for? Maybe a JavaScript package? I'm sure there'd be a JavaScript package that would do this, right? Did you know there is a HTML element? Well, two HTML elements, actually. There is the details element and the summary element. These are used in conjunction with one another and allow us to define a bit that's clickable, which is our question, and a bit of content that will appear or disappear depending on whether our section is open. So if we go through and have a look at our FAQ section in our beautiful application, this already exists here. No JavaScript. I actually don't have to do anything here. I've just used the right HTML element. And I can go through and expand and collapse each of my sections. Still no JavaScript. The details and summary elements have pretty good browser support as well. So I did just say, please don't go and implement this stuff in production. This one you can. This one is ready to go. This one is ready for production. full disclosure, if you are having to support, I think IE is about the only one. If you are having to support an older browser, the support's pretty good. They just all appear open rather than being expandable and collapsible. So that one's pretty good. But this is actually one of the things you can continue to use yourself. Next, form validations. How do we do form validations? Server-side. So that answer's not fun. Maybe JavaScript? Might do that with JavaScript. We know we need to validate our form inputs because do we trust our users to input the right data? I'm actually seeing some heads nodding, and I do not believe any of you. We don't trust our users to give us the exact data that we want in the format that we want. Thankfully, there are a bunch of HTML things that we can use to validate this without having to go to JavaScript or even before it gets to the server side. Yes, we might be validating the form submission on server side, but we can validate it on the page fairly easily. First is required fields. Now, this is one that's existed for a while. We can add a required attribute to our form field, and it won't let you submit the form if it's not filled in. It's great. Very easy to do. If a field is required, make sure you're doing this. The other form of validation that we often end up doing is the format that the data is coming in. So this is really important for some fields like dates and phone numbers. Did you know that there is a native HTML input which has a date picker and a time picker, and it's accessible, and it works on most devices and browsers, and it works the way users expect it to on their device and browser, and it gives it back in a standard format. If I submitted a form with the date 09/11/2023, is it in September or is it in November? 09/11. Is it the 9th of November or the 11th of September? Depends where you are. Yes, it depends when you are, but then there's still a whole bunch of things that are based in countries that do dates weird, and even if you might not expect it, that's the way we do it. There is, however, a HTML element which will give the date back in a standard format. It has a nice date picker, and it's ready for people to use. We can also define formats for things like telephone numbers. We can define a pattern for how we expect it to be filled in. So this is really useful for things like if we want to get a country code along with a phone number. Would I be safe to assume that most of the time you're putting in a country code with a phone number here? Would you, if someone asked for your phone number in a form, would you put in the country code or just your phone number? Country code or just phone number? There's a few. This often means we have to go back through and validate things afterwards, or stuff might break with the way we're doing things, but we can define the pattern that we expect. So we can define to say, okay, we do actually expect a country code to be at the start, and it won't let people submit the form without it. So if I have a look at our contact form here, and I can fill in my phone number. Well, okay, I didn't fill in my name, Amy. When did I first learn JavaScript? Today. And phone number. Please match the requested format. So I've defined that I would like to have a country code. If I actually put in a phone number, which is not my phone number, by the way, so don't go try. Please match the requested format. But if I started off with +6, 1, it doesn't want the plus. There we go. What format have I given it? Ah, dashes. Okay, that's silly. What was it? 4. Anyone remember the format? Phone. Oh, 334. 3, 3, 4. I also have one number too many. There, it's happy. Now it's happy with my phone number, and it will let me submit the form. So we can go through and perform a lot of this validation on the browser side without having to delve into JavaScript or doing anything on the server. This is really useful because it's such an easy tool to implement. I just recommend some better error messages to people or telling them the format that you're expecting. Now, for my notes have not told me what element this is for. I'm going to hazard a guess that this is in terms of the required element, I think, the required attribute. That one's been out for quite a while. And the tell attribute, no, date picker attribute. This is where we can go through, and this one has good support as well. Full disclosure on this stuff, as we've seen, there are limited validation capabilities. You can add some JavaScript, and that allows you to customize the error the browser gives back. So worth looking into if you're doing this. Now that we've looked at some HTML, we're going to look at a bit of CSS and see what we can do. There are quite a few useful things that we can do with CSS and no JavaScript, like nesting. Who here is familiar with using a CSS preprocessor or postprocessor so we can nest? Yep. Range sliders, another common one, testimonial carousels, switch toggles, and image carousels, which we love image carousels. We so love working with building and using image carousels. So we're going to go through and do this. Going to start off with nesting. So quite a few people were familiar with what I mean when I say CSS nesting. This is actually native CSS now. Browsers support the ability to write nested CSS, so we don't need to use a pre or a post processor anymore. I recommend having a look at the exact standard, but this allows us to go through and rather than writing div p and then div pa and div pa.myElement, we can go through and nest it and reduce the amount of code that we're having to write. This browser support, this is very, very new. So it is supported in all major browsers from this year only. So probably not something you want to use in production just yet, unless you can guarantee your entire audience are people who have the most up-to-date browsers. But this is exciting to see it coming out, and we can reduce a lot of it. Most of the time that I end up using a preprocessor or a post-processor for CSS is because I just want to nest things. I want to not have to write out a whole string like 4 times just to get something. So this is exciting to see. Next, I want to have a look at range sliders. So you might be familiar with range sliders. We often use them for feedback forms. You are from a range of not happy to very happy, and kind of meh. Not either of them is somewhere in between. Now there's a HTML element for this. There's a form input of range, and we can define a minimum and a maximum value, which gives us something to work with. But that often makes things a little bit difficult because we need to convey where people are going. Like, am I rating this out of 100 or out of 5? Is this, and how do those numbers relate to where it is that I am? For example, anyone familiar with the NPS rating system? A couple of people? So it's how a lot of companies rate customer service. If you submit a support request and they come back and they're like, well, how would you like to rate our service? We want to know what we can do better. And you go, well, you know, they helped me, but I didn't like that I had to contact them. So you give them somewhere in the middle. You give them a 5 out of 10. That's what you do. If they're really unhelpful, you give them less. The way the system works is anything less than a 7 is negative. So everyone that goes, well, I'm not overly happy, but I'm not unhappy, and goes middle of the road, is actually marking them down. These kinds of things make it hard because we assume the middle is neutral. But we can add labels to our range sliders, which allow us to more accurately define what the different options are. We can do this by adding a data list element. We can put a whole bunch of options inside that, and we can then link those through as labels that appear next to a range slider. So if I have a look, here we have a range slider. How much do you know JavaScript? I don't know. 5 out of 10? 9 out of 10? How can I rate that? So we can go through and we can actually define some slightly nicer values so that people understand what it is that we're looking for. I'm going to write a little bit more CSS now. So first of all, I'm going to go through. I'm going to find my form. And I'm going to take advantage of nesting. I'm then going to use the has selector. Now, this is a bit of a new one and allows us to check what's inside of an element, what CSS selectors are inside of an element without having to actually go down into it. So this is anyone who's heard of people wanting a parent selector, this is about as close as we've been able to get to a parent selector, and most of the time it does work. So I'm going to check for a form, but I'm specifically checking, not range. I'm specifically checking for a form that has an input of the type range inside of it. I then want to check, so I can go through and do it that way. I then want to get my input of type range. And first of all, I actually kind of want to make it bigger, width 100%. I then want to get the data list that exists directly after that. So not any other sibling, the one directly after it, because I might have multiple range sliders. I'm going to get the data list directly after it, and I'm going to set that to be display grid. And I'm going to define some columns in my grid. I'm going to say 50 pixels. Repeat for 1FR, 2M, 50 pixels. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to define a grid layout, and I want it to have a 50 pixel column on either side, and then I want it to repeat 4 times in the middle, a column that will grow and shrink as I need it to, and then a column that is like twice the base font size at that point. And if I refresh, at the very least, I should see a whole bunch of labels appearing at the bottom. Apologies, I know they're a little bit small, but the content of them, not important right now. So I have a whole bunch of labels that appear under my slider, but they're not aligned very nicely. So now I'm going to go through and I'm going to get my options inside my data list. And grid column end span 3. I want it to span across 3 of the columns that I've defined. Grid column start 1. Okay, now what I am going to want to do, and I highly recommend if anyone's not familiar with CSS Grid and they're a little bit confused, have a look on NDC Conferences YouTube, and I've given a talk on CSS Grid a couple of times, once or twice or 8 times at an NDC before. So check that one out. That's my little shameless plug. I'd say for the day, but I can't guarantee it might not happen again. So we're going to go through, and this is where I'm going to start to use a little bit of magic. I want to know how many labels I need to be laying out, but I can't count how many things. However, our has selector back up here, I can start to do some work with that. So I'm already checking for a form, and it has a range input on the inside. I'm then going to check that must then have an element directly afterwards that's a data list. The data list should contain an option, and the option should be the first child that exists. What I can then do is I can define a CSS variable option of 1, because I know it has one option, because that's the first option that exists inside of it. Therefore, I know I have at least one option. I can then go through and I can check has input type range. Copilot wasn't working for me earlier, and I had to write all this in manually, but now it's decided to play nice again. So I can type in has input type range, data list, option, nth child 2. If there's an option that's a second child, I know there is at least 2, and I define options to be 2. Now, because of how CSS works with the cascade, I know that whichever one it writes down will overwrite the previous one, and I can go through, and I can't count, but I can, in a very, very long, drawn-out way, define and work out how many options I have available. Yeah, I'm not writing them all in. Now, this is where one of the things where pre-processor or post-processor being able to programmatically generate these selectors kind of useful. But I can go through and I can then know on my form input how many options on the range selector it has. So now I can go through, and here I have defined that I want 4 sets of columns, but I actually want the number of sets of columns of labels that I have. So I'm going to go through, and I'm going to use my CSS variable, and I'm going to define that many columns. And it's going to create, whoop, wrong link. It's going to create a whole bunch more columns, and they're going to sit a little bit weird. So I can go through and do that. Right. Next, I want to lay these out a little bit nicer. So here I've set them to start at grid column 1, which is all the way at the beginning, but I don't want to do that. I want to go through, and I'm going to create another CSS variable for column, which I'm going to give a value to in a second. I want it to start at that one. And because these won't all fit in one line, I actually want each alternate one to go down a row. So I'm going to get any option as nth child of 2n, so every second one, grid row start 2. So that should go the next row down, and things will sort of stagger a little bit. So I can go through and do that. Now, what I then need to go through and do is have my columns, although I think I have them. Yep, I have them elsewhere. So I have another code where I wrote the columns because going through and writing this thing again and defining the columns, which we don't need to do. So I can then go through and I can align all of these nice and neatly along. I think I've got an extra column that I need. I can go through and define these nice and neatly all the way along my range. And I can now see labels which better align with how I should be ranking my range slider. So I can go through and do that. One last thing to get this nice and neatly is quick little fix. I want to go through, I've set this to be width 100%, but I don't quite want that. I want calc 100% minus 100% divided by the number of options I have, which should give me a nice little gap on either side so my labels line up a little bit better. Yeah. Very nice little labels, and I can then tell a little bit more about how I'm ranking my JavaScript skills. So that's pretty cool. Now, browser support on range slider is pretty good. It's been around for a while. Not great. Oh, wait. No, this isn't. Sorry. This is on the has selector. So this is the has. I had in my speaker notes which thing I was testing browser support for, and it's not appearing in my speaker notes. So apologies on that one. This is the has selector. No, this is the range slider. This is the has selector. So the has selector, unfortunately, has a little bit less support available, but it's meant to be coming to Firefox. Nope. That one's meant to be coming to Firefox at some point soon. I am going to share my slides at the end and make sure I tell everybody which element I'm quoting browser support on, so that you can go through and have a look at that. Has selector, unfortunately, does not exist in Firefox, which makes me really, really sad, but I'm really hoping that is going to change at some point soon. Next, testimonial sliders, carousels, whatever you want to call it. We have them on our websites. That's where we tell people that we're not weirdos and we can be trusted, and our clients or new prospective clients should trust us enough to give us lots of money to do our jobs. Now, to build testimonial sliders, we can take advantage of the radio input. So we often use these on forms, but instead we can take advantage of them to show and hide testimonials, depending on what people have selected. So, testimonials. I can have a look here. Here I have some lovely testimonials that some of the amazing speakers have given me today about why we don't like JavaScript. So we're going to go through and add them to a slider. So I want to get testimonials and display grid. Grid template rows. I want to define the rows to be one auto-sizing row and then one row that's as big as it needs to be. And then grid template columns. I'm going to take advantage of my has selector hack that I used before to repeat number of testimonials, and I want it to auto-size that column. And then I want one FR to exist on the end. Justify content should be center because I want everything to center nicely. I'm then going to go through and copy this because we just talked about how the has selector works to be able to count the number of elements that exist. I'm going to go through and count, does this testimonials element has a block quote that's the first of its type. I'm specifically using nth of type this time because there's a whole bunch of other things in there. So I do actually want to count just the first block quote, second block quote, and so on and so forth. Next, I want to go through and I'm going to get some inputs. So I want to look for an input with a type of radio, and I'm going to set that to be display none. I don't want that to appear. I then want to check if a testimonial is, if a radio input is checked, if a radio input is checked, I want to get the label that exists directly after it, and then I want to get the block quote that exists directly after it. And I'm going to change the opacity to be 1, and I'm going to change the pointer events to be auto, because we're going to go through and override this in a second. Next, I'm going to go through and grab my block quotes. And I'm going to set pointer events to be none. What this means is I can't click on it. And I'm going to set opacity to be 0. And I'm going to set that to sit in my grid column 1 to -1. So that will go from the start to the end. So start to end. And then I'm going to set grid row to be 1 to 2. So I'm being very explicit about how I'm defining it in this case because I need to. Now, I think this should give us something that we can have a look at here. Yep, this has given us a whole bunch of things that don't say anything at all. But I think if I click here, there. So I can go through and click on my different testimonials and they will show and hide depending on which I'm clicking on. However, I don't want people to click on testimonial. I want to give them something nicer to click on. So I'm going to go through and get my label. I'm going to use Flexbox here to make things align nicely. Line item center, because we all know that's the best way to vertically center something. I'm going to set the color to be transparent because I don't want the text of the label to actually appear. I'm going to set the font size to be 1 pixels because I don't want it to appear. What I'm doing now is I'm hiding it visually, but it will still exist for screen readers, so people do actually kind of know what they're clicking on. And then going to set a margin of 5 pixels to add a bit of a gap. I want the labels to all appear after the block quotes in the grid, so I'm going to set the order to be 2, position relative, grid row 2, because I want them to start on the second row, and I'm going to change my cursor to a pointer because I want people to know that they can click on things. So the pointer will give me I'd say it will give me a nice thing, but we've just established I've hidden it, so they're all 1 pixels high and I can't see them. So next, I want to go through and I'm going to set a before and after pseudo selector on this, give that a height of 20 pixels, a width of 20 pixels, border radius 50% because I want to make it round, border 2 pixels, solid, and I'm going to use my green color that I have, set that to be display block, and then I'm going to go through and give the content attribute, and I'm going to give the after attribute a background, which I'm going to copy and paste. I'm going to give that a background and position absolute it. What I'm then going to do is I can come back up here. So what this should do is this will then give me a whole bunch of little dots here. So I can go through and get them there. What I then want to do is go back up here, where this is where I've checked if a radio input is checked. I show and hide the testimonial. I'm also going to, if the radio input is checked, I want the after pseudo selector to appear as well. And this should give me a nicely styled functional radio button looking thing. But I could style this however I wanted to. Lastly, because on first refresh, none of these are checked, which means nothing's actually appearing. I then want to go through and I want to check if not has input type radio checked. I want to get the block quote that is the first of type and set opacity to be 1, pointer events to be auto, and I want to get the first label and assign that the content. So what that's checking for is I'm using the has selector to check, does my testimonials element contain a radio input that is checked? If it doesn't, this is what my not selector does, if it doesn't contain one that is checked, I'm going to pretend that the first one's checked. I'm going to simulate that the first one is checked using CSS, which means the first one will always appear, and I can continue to click through the rest of them. Now, I do have one little problem with this little input is sitting all the way over here by itself. So I'm going to use a little bit of a hack. I mean, not that the rest of this hasn't been a hack. I'm going to give it the testimonials element a before pseudo element. I'm going to give that a content. And then I'm going to set grid row to be 2. So that's going to sit all the way down there. And grid column start to be 1, which is also going to sit all the way down there. And what this does is this will give me a pretend element to sit in that corner, which will push my other elements all the way over. And my little toggle selectors have sitting very nicely in the center, which is pretty cool. So we use the has selector to go through and count things. We talked about the has selector. Browser support's relatively new. It is really powerful though, and so it's going to be really exciting. Anybody here happen to be a developer for browsers? If anybody here happen to be a developer for Firefox, it'd be really great to see this come out more, because I'm excited to be able to use this a bit more. The not selector has been around for a while, so that one's got pretty good support. And I'm trying to think of what I'm checking for here. I will find out and get back to you all on this one. Something has pretty good support. I want to say it was radio, but radio feels like it's older than this. Full disclosure on this. We're using form inputs outside of forms, which isn't great. It's not spectacular for accessibility, and it's confusing for people who are using screen readers. So if you are doing this, I would highly recommend you use ARIA labels and attributes to give more information about what it is and what each of the elements are doing. Also, yeah, has is not supported in Firefox, so that's not spectacular. Next. Toggle switches. We love using switches. We love designing switches. We love building switches. We love using switches because it is always so clear whether or not the switch, we consented to give the company all of our information, or have I said no? It's not always super clear, but we love using them anyway. This is another way we can take advantage of radio inputs to simulate a switch. So here I have a number of radio inputs. The radio inputs all have labels. And I also then have a span at the bottom, which I'm going to style to become my switch. So let's have a look at this. And have a look at my toggle. So, I should probably look at my toggle page here. I have radio inputs and I have labels, as we can very clearly see there. So I'm going to look for my toggle. I'm going to set display, flex, justify content, center, line item center, because that's the best way to vertically center something. And I want to get any label that exists inside. I'm going to copy and paste a bit of this because we don't need to go through and type. I'm going to get any label that exists inside of my toggle element. I'm going to hide the actual content of the, no, I'm not. I'm going to set that to sit either end and set the font size and give it a little bit of padding. So this should then sit next to one another. I then want to go through and get my input type radio, and I want to get the label that exists directly after the radio, and I'm going to give it a pseudo element again, and I'm going to set position absolute. I'm going to make the position absolute, the pseudo element exist all the way around, exactly on the size, and then I'm going to give it a Z index value so it appears over it. So this is going to create a pseudo element which just exists over the label. Then, wait, I already checked for that. Okay, I then want to get any input with a type of radio that has a value of on. I can check what the field value is. I then want to get the label that exists after that one, and I want to set the order to be 2 because I want that to appear at the end of my element. Order to be 2, not 1. Then I want to give that pseudo element. I'm actually going to get that one to sit all the way on the right hand side, but the left I'm going to use a little bit of calc magic, and I'm actually going to make that overlap over my switch when the switch exists, which we'll look at in a second. Next, I want to go through and check when the value, I should probably actually go through and actually style my switch first. So I'm going to go through for my switch, which is the span that exists. I'm going to set display block. I want to size that to be a nice little size. I'm going to give it a border. I have a nice little circle because that's how switches work. And I'm going to put that in the center there. So here I have a little switch, which currently does nothing. So I'm going to go through and style this to do something a little bit more. So next I'm going to check my input with a value of on. When it's checked, I would like to get the switch that appears after it, not directly after it, it's some other time after it. So I would like the switch to appear some point after it. And I'm going to set the background color to be current color. So this will match the rest of the color that my font is. And I'm going to work with the pseudo element. I've given the switch to move to the other side, and I'm going to give it a bit of a transition. All right, 0.5 is in, out. Next, I want to get inputs with a value of off and get the label directly after it. Its pseudo element. I'm just going to copy and paste this one so I can talk about it. Going to get the input with a value of off. We're going to get the label, and we're going to make its pseudo element also overlap the switch. We're then going to also check if the radio input is not checked. We're going to make sure the pseudo element actually appears. What this will do is, this means our pseudo element appears over the switch. I think I've done something and it's not working there. What it should do is this will appear over the switch. and we'll make it clickable. This one is not working. However, this one at the bottom of the page is working. So here I have a toggle for a theme selector, because we all know that we love to have dark mode and light mode, and I should have a toggle switch so that I can change it. So how can we do this? Now, CSS has a media query where we can actually check the user's device. Who here has their device set to dark mode? Exactly. We're developers. Dark mode is the only correct answer to do these things. We can check whether or not a user has set their device to dark mode or light mode, and we can change the colors we're using accordingly. However, sometimes people don't always want to have everything dark mode. Sometimes there are some things where I prefer some websites in light mode to dark mode, and I would like the ability to control that. So we're going to use our toggle, and here I have a bunch of colors that I can use, and I have some dark colors and some light colors. I'm just going to copy and paste this in here. Nope, not that one. I'm going to copy and paste this in here, and this will go through and check, does my body contain a theme toggle which has an input of type radio, which has a value of light that is checked. If my theme toggle is on light, I give it my light colors. If my theme toggle is on dark, I give it my dark colors. And I can now go through and change dark mode and light mode. No JavaScript. No JavaScript whatsoever. That's pretty cool. So we talked about the has selector, not spectacular, but hopefully soon. Prefers color mode, so actually checking for native, does the device have dark mode or light mode selectors. That's pretty good, so it's worth going through and using that one. Similar to testimonials, full disclosure, using form inputs outside of forms where users aren't expecting them. Not spectacular, so adding ARIA labels to provide additional context. This is also an input, and as soon as someone refreshes the page, it will default the toggle back to the original state, and it won't save it. However, JavaScript could allow you to add a more complex function or to save the value in local storage or a cookie or something. And on reload or revisiting the website or another page, you would be able to go through and save that there. I think we've got just enough time to go through and have a look at our image carousels. And I might copy and paste the code over. The image carousels, a lot of the HTML is similar to how we had the block quotes, and we're going to go through and conditionally hide and show images based on what our radio inputs are. I'm just going to copy and paste this over. So we're using display grid to align everything nicely. I'm going to have an image in the middle, and I want to have controllers on the sides. So the sides are where my radio inputs are going to go. I want the image to stay in the middle. I'm going to set that one to be really big, and I've added a transition. To give a nice animation. Apologies for going through this really quickly as well. So if anyone has any questions on this afterwards, feel free to come and I'll explain the code better. So we're going to add a bit of a transition on the image because we like an animated carousel. I'm going through and I'm hiding the actual content of the labels again, but I'm using a pseudo element to give me a button to click, and then showing and hiding the pseudo element and the images based on whether or not the radio input is checked. And I am using arrow emojis for my buttons. And if I go through and have a look at my carousel, I have an animated, functioning image carousel using no JavaScript whatsoever, just HTML and CSS. So that is pretty cool. Browser support for this is a fair bit better. So we're able to go through and check whether or not things have been checked, but we are using the has selector in this case, which again, Firefox, not spectacular. Full disclosure, carousels still suck in my opinion. I will actively try and discourage every client that asks for a carousel from having a carousel, and if they insist that they do in fact want a carousel, I have what's called a carousel surcharge where I'll do it but I don't want to, and you're going to pay for the fact that I think it's a bad idea. Carousels, not great for accessibility, not great for performance, whole different discussion. Because we're using form inputs, again, also not great for accessibility. We're kind of changing the way people are expecting things. You should also turn off the animation depending on user settings in case people have an impairment where they don't like to have animation on their screen that they don't expect. You can do this. Basically, I say don't do any of this, but if you build a carousel, this is how you can do it. So I've gone through and copied and pasted a bit of code and wrote a bunch of code as well. And, you know, this is a talk, so clearly I'm not going to lie to you. I wouldn't, you know, fake all of this and make it seem like this was without JavaScript and have secretly running JavaScript in the background. So because I know that you don't trust me, and because I know there's at least one person who doesn't believe that you can do this without JavaScript, there is a website which I will post out on Twitter and Blue Sky and maybe Mastodon. Have I missed another Twitter, Blue Sky, Mastodon? There's no other ones yet. We had another one yet? Threads? I don't want to have to open Threads again. I'll post it on a bunch of socials so you can come and get the link from me afterwards. This website will work without JavaScript, and you can have a look if you don't trust me. I will also tweet out the code so you can have a look at it afterwards. JavaScript is useful. It is a very useful tool, but it's not always the answer. Going forward, I would like you to have a think about when you're building something, can you do this with HTML? Are you trying to put in, who here's implemented a date picker? Who here implemented a date picker using a JavaScript package? Most of the time, we can probably use the HTML input. There are limitations on the styles that we can apply for it, but when it's an MVP product or it's a mock-up or an internal product, it doesn't actually matter. It's functional, it works, there's no JavaScript. So next time you go to implement JavaScript, have a think. Can you do it with HTML? Can you do it with CSS? Are you using JavaScript for animations where you could just use CSS instead? But JavaScript isn't bad, so I also want you to think, can JavaScript make it better? Is the JavaScript that I'm writing improving things rather than making it worse? JavaScript is useful for a lot of things and adds advanced functionality. But CSS and HTML is great for the basis, JavaScript for making it better. I also want you to go through and have a look at some of your code bases and have a think about whether JavaScript can be removed. Is there JavaScript you don't need anymore? Can you take it out? Can you replace it with something else? The other thing I want you to check is, do you really, really need the tracking script? Is anybody actually looking at the analytics results? Like, if you take it out, will anyone actually notice? So have a look at any of the third-party scripts you have running on your website. Have a think about whether or not you need it, whether or not it's being used, or whether it could be taken out. Now, I have stickers, and I left them in the hotel, so if people want stickers, please come and find me tomorrow, and I will remember to bring the stickers tomorrow. Are there any questions? No questions? In that case, thank you everybody for your time this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope maybe we can write a little bit less JavaScript, a little bit more HTML and CSS in future. I will be around for the rest of the conference, so if you have any questions or would like to have a look at the code or just want to, have a whinge about JavaScript, come up and find me at some point afterwards. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.